Hello, thanks for joining us for worship today. We're so glad that you've joined us. We are continuing our series, Emotional Damage, where we have been looking at how our own emotional health or lack of health go hand in hand with our spiritual health. So if you missed last week or any of our other messages, you can find them all by visiting our YouTube page. And be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you can be alerted whenever we post any new videos that we might have. Before we jump into the gathering, don't forget to hit that share button. You can also text a friend the link ransom.online and invite them to watch with you. Also remember to check in and let us know that you're watching. You can either click the link in the chat or scan the QR code that's on the screen. As you check in, you can share any prayer requests or praises that you might have, and you can also share with us if you want to join or start a watch party, and I would love to follow up with you. Again, we're so glad that you're here today. Wherever you are, let's worship.
Welcome to Ransom Church. We're so excited you're here. Before we jump into the sermon for today, I just want to invite you one more time personally to join us for our movie event on February 21st at Dolly Farms Theater as we join with Celebrate Church and Linwood Wesleyan Church, which are the other two Wesleyan churches in town, for Jesus Revolution. You can get your tickets right here on the QR code. If you can't scan the QR code because you're sitting too far back, you can go to the app and go into the events there, and it's there. If you don't have the app, you can go to the website and the events page. And if you don't know how to get to the website, you just don't get to go to the movie. You're too old. It's just that there's nothing I can do for you at that point. But you can stop by our information center. We'd love to help you out there if you are technologically challenged, and we'll help you out. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. We are in week 6 of our series, Emotional Damage. And last week, we wrestled with this incredibly tough topic of what it means to journey through the wall and how the freedom God has for us can only be found when you do the hard work of pressing through the wall. Now, we're over halfway. There are only 3 sermons left. You might be thinking, whew, thank the Lord. We made it. We're on the other side. We did the hard work. It's going to be smooth sailing from here to the end of the sermon series. Well, not quite yet. So, as long as we're down there under the iceberg, let's deal with one more thing while we're down there. So, today we're going to talk about enlarging your soul through grief and loss. And I know what you're thinking. Seriously, how much darker is this thing going to get? Pastor Phil, I am breaking out in hives from all of the vulnerability and all of that. It's killing me. But I got to tell you, I know vulnerability's hard. But is the healing not worth it? I think the healing is worth it. And so today, we're going to challenge you, now that you're pushing through and you're dealing with things and you're doing the hard work of owning your losses. That's it. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to own our losses. So, when we talk about loss, we have a tendency to minimize it as much as we can. There's a quote by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Here's a beautiful picture of Friedrich Nietzsche. This quote was made famous by Kelly Clarkson's song, so we did that. And here's the quote. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You thought Kelly Clarkson came up with that? It was Friedrich Nietzsche, you know? Let me ask you this question, though. Have you ever found that statement to be true in your life? That what doesn't kill you makes you stronger? Does your grief, does your loss, does your pain automatically make you stronger? I've seen so many people struggling with hard times, and many of them don't, seem to come out the other side stronger. Maybe you've experienced, grief or loss or hurt in your past, and you lost a dream, you lost a relationship, you lost an opportunity, and even though it was years ago, you are still frozen in that moment. Okay, you're still living out life through the lens of that loss. You're still struggling with grief or anger or hurt, and you can't seem to get over it, and it didn't make you stronger. In some ways, it's killing you, or killing life as you knew it, at the very least. So, in the book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, in chapter 5, there's a story of a man named Jerry Sitzer. Okay, Jerry Sitzer, who lost his wife, his daughter, and his mother in a car accident, all in the same accident. 3 generations gone in a moment, just like that. They were hit by a drunk driver who then went on and wasn't even convicted. Can you imagine getting stuck in that? How do you move on? Do you move on? How can you even get out of that? Well, Sitzer would go on to write a book called A Grace Disguised. And in that book, he makes a mind-blowing statement. He says, the experience of loss does not have to be the defining moment in our lives. Instead, the defining moment can be our response to the loss. It is not what happens to us that matters so much as what happens in us. It is therefore not true that we become less through loss unless we allow the loss to make us less. Loss can also make us more. It depends on the choices we make. The question I want to know is how do I get there? How do we get to that point? We've all experienced loss and grief on some level, but that loss doesn't have to define you. And the key is learning to deal with the grief and loss. So instead of getting stuck in this bitter and cynical cycle, you can actually find hope. You can grow in love. Your loss can make you more instead of less. How do we get there? Here's a truth we all need to recognize. Grief and loss will transform us or destroy us, but they will never leave us the same. And perhaps the thing you need to understand the most is that the direction you go there, the choice is actually up to us. There's no going back to change the past. There's no erasing the loss, but we do have a choice whether that loss will crush us or whether we will allow God to transform us and to actually enlarge our soul through that grief and loss. So, when I mention loss, people often go worst case scenario and they think loss, they think death. And in our minds, death is the greatest loss. And if you've experienced the death of a loved one or a friend, there's truly no greater sense of loss from a human perspective than that. And since we label all loss as negative, we try to avoid it. We try to avoid all the emotions. And yet, in a way, all of life is loss. Let me give you some examples. Since we've planted Ransom Church in 2009, I have lost quite a bit of my youthfulness. Okay? I've come to grips with it. You can own it. Yes, Pastor Phil, you have. No amount of exercise can undo what time is doing to my body, right? I do exercise. Now it's just to keep up, okay? Every time you change jobs or you move, even if it's for a promotion you wanted, there's a sense of loss. And there is in that change, in that transition, a certain sense of loss. You buy a new car and it gets old and eventually breaks down. Your favorite show eventually gets canceled. Your pets eventually get old and die. And while the movie says that all dogs go to heaven, with cats, not a chance. But your kids grow up and leave you at home as an empty nester. There's an increase as you get older in caregiving for your aging parents. Everything that you know kind of comes to an end. Some of you experience catastrophic loss, like a family member dies, or a spouse has an affair, or you're trying to figure out how to be single again after a divorce. Some of you're walking with, or you are the one who's been diagnosed with cancer, and you're walking through that. Some of you lose a job after like 25 years. People experience miscarriages and infertility and all these things. Some have, lost dreams, lost career, lost marriage, lost children. Some of you are right now experiencing this transition we're making with West Campus as an incredible loss. And can I be honest with you? I am too. Every one of these things in life come with a loss, but on the other side of loss, there can be new life and new opportunity. For instance, getting older, age brings good things that youth can't. Yes, our car wears out, but that means we can then enjoy another new car, or a new house, or a new puppy, or whatever the case may be. And though there's loss on the one side of the situation, there can be life on the other side of loss. Those losses can enlarge us, they can deepen us, they can help us grow, and even offer unexpected blessing on the other side. So here's something we have to own. Blessing often follows loss, and hope can follow grief. Our goal today as followers of Jesus Christ is to take a look at grief and loss from a biblical perspective, because in church today, we actually don't handle loss very well at all. We don't talk about it well. We don't deal with it well. Scazzaro says the church actually has very little theology when it comes to things like anger and grief and depression and loss. Rarely do churches do sermons on handling loss. Rarely do churches even give you permission to admit that you have grief. In a lot of ways, churches often associate things like anger and sadness and grieving with being unspiritual or lacking spiritual maturity. And so it's almost as if something is wrong with our walk with God if we're experiencing grief for what it is. And so we quote scriptures about how if Christ is for us, who can be against us? And we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us and all that. And we convince ourselves that those scriptural truths don't actually leave any room for grief, and then we inevitably experience grief, which leads us to question our faith. And then worse yet, others around us begin to look at us and question our faith as well. Maybe they weren't as strong in their faith as I thought, because look at how sad they are. And what we don't realize is that in denying the reality of grief is that, here's the deal. You can do all things through Christ who strengthens you, and that includes navigating grief in a way that allows him into the grief and allows him to heal you and use the grief to enlarge your soul. Okay? And at worship night on February 19th, we're going to be starting a weekly devotional for Lent that will take us through some of this exercise and allow us to do this type of stuff together. Okay? But many of us, rather than allow Christ into that process in our lives, we feel like, I got to be happy. I got to be joyful. I got to put on the smile. Scazzaro said this. He said, sadly, the result of denying and minimizing our wounds over many years is that we become less and less human, empty Christian shells with painted, smiley faces. What he's saying is that for so many, church is not a place we feel safe to not be okay. Listen, it's okay to be struggling with grief and loss, and when we feel sad, when we feel like we need to hide it, don't hide it. I cannot speak, please hear me, I can't speak for every single church, but you're safe here. It's okay to not be okay here. And by the way, if you're here and you're not okay with people not being okay, that's not okay. But it's okay because here it's okay to not be okay, even if you're not okay. Even for you, okay? So, confused yet? Let's go. All right. The Bible actually has a lot to say about this topic. In fact, there's an entire book in scriptures called Lamentations. It's all about lamenting. 2/3 of the Psalms are prayers and songs of lament and grief. I mean, Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. Loss is not something we have to ignore or gloss over. Loss is actually a critical part of your personal discipleship. When you learn to grieve properly, it enlarges your soul, and it actually helps you become more like Jesus. Did you know Jesus himself was acquainted with grief and loss? So today I want to talk to you about a beautiful story from Jesus' life in a time where he was absolutely not okay, and he admitted so as much. And as we walk through the story together, I want you to learn by watching Jesus how he deals with grief and loss, because we all need to learn that rather than avoid it, we need to learn how to trust God with it. So, Matthew chapter 26. If you're using one of our Bibles, we'll be on page 595. If you didn't bring a Bible, you can raise your hand. The ushers will bring you one. If you don't own a Bible, please raise your hand. We want to give you one as a gift. Today, we're going to join Jesus in a garden. We're going to join him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, this picture that they're going to put up here is what Gethsemane looks like today. Okay, I was not able to get a picture of Gethsemane from back then because I wasn't there, but it was this beautiful, secluded garden located right outside the walls of Jerusalem. Jesus is there. He's about to experience the worst grief and loss of his entire life on earth. It's the night before Jesus will be crucified, and just hours before he'll be arrested and he'll be betrayed by Judas, who was one of his disciples and someone that he had trusted dearly. So this moment is perhaps the most human we will ever see Jesus, as he experiences all these emotions, these human emotions of fear and grief. Matthew 26, starting with verse 36. Then Jesus went to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." He took Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Now, listen, let's just be honest. No one wants to join Jesus in the garden. We want to join him when he's, preaching to the crowds and be able to stand by his side when he does that. We want to stand with him while he's doing miracles. We want to, join him when he jumps out of the boat and walks on water. We want to be there when he multiplies the fish and the loaves and feeds thousands of people. We want to be there when he raises Lazarus for the dead. I want to see that. But no one wants to join Jesus in the garden. Jesus had tried to explain to his disciples what was coming, but they couldn't wrap their heads around what he was saying. He knows he needs to draw away. He needs to spend some time with his Father, preparing his heart for what's about to happen. As for the very first time, he was about to experience God's wrath. Gethsemane was not just a garden, it was an olive grove. The name Gethsemane literally means oil press. It was a place where not only did they grow the olives, but they had these machines that they would squeeze the oil from the olives and press the olives. And by pressing or crushing the olives repeatedly, the oil would come out. And Jesus loved to go there to pray. It was one of his favorite places to pray. And the disciples all knew that. In fact, even Judas knew it. So Judas, when he went to betray Jesus, knew right where to find him. So what you need to understand is Jesus is not hiding from what's about to happen. But this night in the garden, it is Jesus who's being crushed, as he knows the penalty of the sins of the entire world are about to be placed on his shoulders. And so I want to paint 3 pictures of Gethsemane that night. This garden, what did it become that night? Number 1, the garden is a time of deep grief. It's a time of deep grief. We read in verse 37 and 38, he took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He told them, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. You see, Jesus did what we all do when we're hurting. First, he grabbed his closest friends and he took them with him. There seems to have been a especially close relationship with Jesus and these three disciples. But tonight, they're there for companionship. They're not just disciples. These are Jesus' friends. Jesus needs his friends. So he calls the guys closest to him. And here's the thing. When we're hurting, we need to invite people into our suffering with us. Friends who can hurt for us and hurt with us. Okay? These are the guys that he took up the Mount of Transfiguration. These are the three who declared, we're ready to suffer you with Jesus. They were his closest friend. And he now admits how he's really feeling. He tells his friends, and he doesn't pretend, and he asks them to stay and keep watch. Now think about this. The Son of God, Savior of the world, turns for moral support in this moment to three fishermen. This illustrates the absolute power of grief in our lives, and it describes Jesus in this moment. It says he became anguished and distressed. And the words in Greek are far more expressive than English, and they indicate the greatest type of sorrow you can imagine. First off, Jesus knew what awaited him on the cross. Not only the pain, but the mocking and the ridicule. But beyond that, he knew the spiritual horror ahead of him. Jesus would stand in the place of guilt for all sinners and receive the spiritual punishment that we deserve. In fact, it was the spiritual suffering that was before him that likely overwhelmed him far more than the cross itself. It wasn't the dying and the physical pain. It was that he knew for the very first time his Father would turn his face away, and he who knew no sin would become sin for us. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5, for God who made Christ who never sinned to be an offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. Anguished and distressed here is, again, weak language. This is where the emotional actually begins to blend with the physical. Much of the language in verse 37 and 38 highlights this clearly. Jesus claimed that his soul was crushed with grief, even to the point where he just wanted to die. Now, the Gospels rarely describe Jesus' emotions at all. Okay? Sometimes we see him having compassion for hurting people, and then the other times we see that he's righteously angry at the Pharisees, but beyond that, it doesn't go deep into his emotions. But in this moment, in this garden, it is rich with honest emotions. Have you ever felt so overwhelmed you just wanted to die? That's how Jesus was feeling in that moment. He was crushed. Verse 39 says, he went on a little further and bowed with his face to the ground, praying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine. See, the second thing we need to note is that the garden is a time of wrestling. You can hear it in his words, the wrestling, Father, if it's possible. 3 times he prays this, and even as he prayed it, even as he asked it, he knew there was no other way. Without the blood of Jesus shed on the cross for our sins, there's no hope for us. But he doesn't want to drink this cup of suffering. The cup in Scripture is a symbol of both deep sorrow and deep suffering. So what you got to understand here, what's the cup referring to? Jesus wasn't afraid of death. He knew he would raise from the dead and conquer sin and death. He wasn't afraid of death. The cup didn't represent death. It represented judgment. And what I want you to notice is Jesus' honesty about the pain. He says, I don't want to drink this cup of suffering. I don't want to go through this agony and grief. I don't want your face to turn away, Father. If there's any other way, imagine the emotions he was feeling in that moment. Luke, who's a medical doctor, in his account says, when he sweat, it was as if drops of blood were rolling down. Jesus is extremely distressed. He's wrestling with God. He doesn't want to do what God wants him to do. You ever felt that way? N.T. Wright puts it this way. It says, he had looked into the darkness and had seen the grinning faces of all the demons in the world looking back at him, and he begged and begged his Father not to bring him to the point of going through with it. It is in Jesus' pain that we find a beautiful invitation, and it's an invitation to look our grief and our loss straight in the face, to not have to hide it, To not have to put on a brave face, but to own how we really feel, to be honest about where we're afraid, to be honest with others, be honest with ourselves, to be honest with God, because it isn't God's expectation that we pretend we're perfect. And faith is not based on whether or not you struggle, but where faith is really tested is in this moment of honesty where you finally look at God and admit how you're feeling and where you need Him, and you choose in that moment faith. See, we've all prayed the first part of this prayer that Jesus prayed in Gethsemane. We've all prayed, Father, if there's any other way, God, if there's any way you can cure this disease, God, if there's any other way you can restore this relationship, God, if there's any way you can undo that mistake and that bad choice I made and erase the consequence, God, if there's any way, at times we all pray, God, if there's any other way, and we wrestle with that reality of our grief and loss. But it's the second part of the prayer that determines whether your grief will eat you alive and become your prison, or whether you'll allow the grief and loss in your life to become a reality to enlarge your capacity for suffering and make you more like Jesus. It's not just praying, God, if there's any other way, but it's also praying, Father, I want your will to be done, not mine. I want your will, God. Because see, number 3, the garden is a place of weakness. Verse 40. Then he returned to the disciples and found them asleep. He said to Peter, couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? Keep watch and pray so you'll not give into temptation, for the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. Guess what? Everyone lets Jesus down. And I don't mean everyone then, I mean everyone lets Jesus down. 3 times. Jesus asked these guys, his closest friends, to keep watch. 3 times they are well-intentioned in doing just that, and 3 times they fall asleep and he finds them snoozing. Jesus really needed them, and they weren't there. And really, we're no different, are we? We sin, and we do it out of ignorance, and we do it out of weakness. Sometimes we do it out of laziness, or we do it out of selfishness, and at times when Jesus needs us, we are often asleep at the wheel. But here's why this is really, really good news. Jesus didn't give up on them, and he doesn't give up on you either. He allows room for our shortcoming and our failure and our weakness. Here's what I want you to get out of all of this as it relates to emotionally healthy spirituality. It may be time for your own personal garden. No one wants to join Jesus in the garden, but it was through this time, in this garden with God, that Jesus ultimately was ready to face the cross. But what got him there was being honest about his deep grief. There was wrestling, there was weakness, and guess what? If you join the emotionally healthy spirituality small groups, you get to dive deeper into that. But even if you don't, consider this in this moment permission for you to quit pretending. Because as long as we feel like we need to present ourselves a certain way, we'll never begin to heal. You'll never deal with your grief. Until you're willing to own it before God and others, you'll never heal. So here are a couple of thoughts from Scazzero's book. These come right out of the chapter, and I think they can help you dip your toe in the water a little bit when it comes to dealing with your grief and loss. First, pay attention to grief and loss. Jesus was incredibly aware of the pain he was feeling. We're used to shoving down our pain, aren't we? Ignoring it, pretending like it's not there. A lot of times, we don't even know how bad we're hurting. The problem is emotions leak. So if you bury your grief and loss deep down and try to ignore it, it's going to eventually leak out in sarcasm and anger and a cutting tone, and you're just going to be a big fat jerkhead. Okay? A very important question we need to ask Jesus is this. Jesus, what am I angry about? Jesus, what am I sad about? If people said to you, man, you seem angry, you seem sad, don't get offended, don't assume you're not. Ask God, why am I angry? Why am I sad? Where am I hurting? What loss did I suffer that I've never noticed, it never really fully grieved? What's really going on, God, below the surface that I'm not aware of? Jesus chose to enter into that and to own his grief, and we need to do the same as well. Second, wait in the confusing in-between. And again, that comes right out of the chapter in the book, but perhaps you can relate to being in a season of life where basically nothing makes sense. You cannot see what's coming. You don't know what's next. When you're in that season, what you want most is to get out of that season as fast as possible, any way possible. But the work God wants to do in you is in the waiting. Jesus stayed in the garden for hours. He prayed the same prayer 3 times, and he surrendered and resurrendered to God's will for him. When my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and dementia, man, I had so much grief. First you pray God will heal them as you watch their memories slip away and you watch them become more forgetful, and you pray that God will heal them, and then they start to hallucinate, and then you pray things will go slower. God, I know it's fine. She's going to be gone someday, but could you just slow it down? Could you just make it last a little longer? Eventually it gets so bad you start praying a different prayer. You start praying, God, just take her. Take her home to be with you in Jesus. And then you feel guilty for even praying that kind of prayer. And in all those prayers, as I prayed through all those seasons, God spoke to me a very clear no. Not yet. And we literally spent like 8 years waiting for my mom to pass. Watching every part of who she was disappear before our eyes. She didn't remember me. She forgot how to eat. Then she forgot how to swallow. She was physically alive, but mentally gone. And it was in every way for us a confusing in between. But in those times, God taught me so much about myself. I struggled to accept his no. It took me years before I was at peace with it. His refinement in me took a lot of crushing and pressing in my life. Time was part of the grieving process. And the deeper the loss, the more grief it takes. But on the other side of that grief, where I am now, there was something sweet God did in me as he taught me what it meant to honor my parents to the end. Wait in the confusing in between. And then number 3, let the old birth the new. And again, this is not just about letting go of past hurts. It's actually letting the hurts refine you until you can actually be thankful for those seasons. It's learning to grieve, then let go so you can grow. Scazzaro says the true spiritual life is not an escape from reality, but an absolute commitment to it. Loss marks the place where self-knowledge and powerful transformation happen if we have the courage to participate fully in the loss. Do you have the courage? Again, group is a great place to dive deeper into this, but I wonder today if anyone here can admit you've been putting on a brave face, but things are not okay. You're in the garden. You're crying out to God, if there's any way, Lord, take this cup from me. And you're stuck and you're hurting and you need prayer. If that's you, we're going to open the altar as the band plays. The pastors are going to be ready to meet with you. So you can come up here and you can confess and you can say, here's what my heart is grieving. Maybe you're here, you don't even know how to grieve. You just need someone to help you take the first step. And so together, come to the altar and we can take that next step of faith. And together we will pray, God, if there's any way, and yet, not your will, or not my will, but yours be done. So come.
As you may wrestle with grief and loss, I want to remind you that you don't have to be alone through your struggles. Please share a prayer request with us as we care about what you are going through. And I encourage you to also continue revisiting the link that we shared a couple weeks ago, ransom.church/prayer wall, where you can share with our church community whatever you're going through, as well as pray for others in our community, and they too will pray for your requests. Let's wrestle together so we can take whatever is causing us pain in our hearts and leave it at the feet of Jesus. Thanks again for joining us today. We're so glad that you were able to join us, and if you're interested in supporting Ransom, you can find all the different ways to give by visiting ransom.church/give. Your gifts help in our mission to set captives free. Thank you for your support. I hope that you've had a fantastic weekend, and I hope you have a great start to your week.